Midi, and I'd like to introduce Laurel Zuckerman, who today is going to be talking about a really interesting subject. It is a really interesting subject for me, that's for sure. It's how to restore art to its rightful owner. Some surprising obstacles. Everyone knows about all the art that was stolen by the. We're talking mostly about the Nazis.
We're only talking about the Nazis.
We're only talking about the Nazis today. A Franco-American writer who grew up in Arizona, Laurel is the author of Sorbonne Confidential and Les Rêves Barbares du Professeur Colli, and the editor of Paris Writers News. Laurel's work currently focuses on the art world and the Holocaust. She explores how linked to open data, natural language processing, network analysis, and the digital tools and techniques of investigative data journalism can be used to identify patterns in false provenances in Nazi-looted art and duress sales. You might have to explain that sentence, okay?
Okay.
In 2016, after 12 years of research, she filed a lawsuit against the Metropolitan Museum of Art for the restitution of Picasso's The Actor. Zuckerman previously worked in corporate IT projects as a super user, project manager, and solutions expert specializing in SAP supply chain systems. She's a member of Investigative Reporters and Editors. Yeah, there's a lot in here I need you to explain. Okay? I think it's a language I'm not sure I understand. Laurel, it's all yours, dear.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, I really want to thank Adrian for inviting me to speak here today, and for all of you for coming. I am, as Adrian said, I'm an American. I was born in Florida and raised in Arizona. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, and do remind me if I'm not speaking loud enough, okay? And I've lived for a long time in France. This is, I'm doing some promotion for my local town. This is the Marne in Brise-sur-Marne, which is very beautiful. And this is a book that I wrote practically 20 years ago, Sorbonne Confidential, which some of you might know, which is a very funny book about the agrégation d'anglais in France and how France creates its elites, and some of the unusual observations an outsider might have. But today I'm not going to talk about that. Today I'm going to talk about research that I was doing at the same time as I was researching Sorbonne Confidential. You know, we all have different parallel lives. And so I'm going to talk about the other thing that I was doing at the time. So I have to look back at the screen just because of a slight technical issue, which it doesn't want to.
That's not moving forward?
No, it's not moving forward now. Let's see. This might be a very short presentation. Let's see. Let's see if we can get this thing going. No, it's completely.
We never did understand why the screen wasn't
No, let's see.
working.
Okay, this might take a minute. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yay!
Yay! All right.
Okay.
So today what I'm going to talk about is what it's really like to be a claimant in a major Holocaust-linked art restitution case against a major museum for a masterpiece. It's not the story that you get in the press.
What was the movie, All the Monuments Men?
The Monuments Men.
Right?
The Monuments Men, yeah.
So the golden, yes.
Yeah, so you all are probably familiar with some of the books and some of the movies that have been made about this period. So I have never given this kind of talk to an audience like this before. I rarely speak about it in public, and when I have spoken about it in public, it was to a specialist audience, either of lawyers or of Holocaust experts or restitution experts. And in the times when I spoke about it before, there were other people who spoke before me for a couple of hours to give the viewers the context, the historical context. And so I'm going to try to do that in 2 minutes, just hitting some of the points that I think are really important for you all to understand, so that we're all on the same page when I talk about this restitution case. So obviously I can't cover everything in 2 minutes, but we're in France, and in France the big traumatic date is in 1940, when Paris fell to the Nazis. And so in the popular imagination, and particularly in France, one thinks of before or after 1940. That's when the Nazis invaded Western Europe and Belgium and Holland and France, and you have this tremendous occupation. And for the Jewish people in those countries, that's when the persecution of those people started. But in Germany, that's not the case. In Germany, the persecution started immediately in 1933. And as soon as the Nazis were elected and Hitler was legally named chancellor in January 1933, the persecution started. So you have this weird period of about 7 years where the people living in France lived completely normal lives. Business totally as usual, kind of like us with Ukraine happening right next door, right? But in Germany, it's already horror. It's horrific. And so the dates that people tend to know are 42, you know, with the official start of the Holocaust, with the gas chambers, that the industrialized mass killings that people think of associating with the Holocaust. Or they might think of 1938, which is Kristallnacht in Germany and in Austria, which had just merged with Nazi Germany, where thousands of shops were destroyed and people were dragged out and beaten and killed, that is Jewish people. And so those are the dates that one has in mind. But you have to understand this story, go back to 1933 and what's happening in Germany to German citizens who are Jewish. So you know from the movies and the books, like Monuments Men, that the Nazis undertook the greatest plundering that the world had ever seen. You see that in the train loads of artworks which are streaming into Germany, and in Monuments Men, that tremendous scene of the salt mines where the Allies are discovering all these masterpieces which have been put into salt mines, you know, where the Germans are trying to hide them. That's all true. Those scenes were very accurate. The rest of the movie, no. But those scenes were very, very accurate.
Oh, but it had a lot of great actors.
It did. It did. They killed off poor Jean Dujardin, though.
Yeah.
So that was sad. But what people often don't know is that plundering Jews, in particular, was an integral part of the Holocaust. That is, moving Jews out of economic life right from the start, making it so they were no longer allowed to exercise their professions. They were no longer allowed to own property, certain property. They had all kinds of rights that were taken away from them year after year after year after year, until the economic space for Jews became so small they could not exist. And it's in that context that there were a lot of sales of all kinds of things, in particular of artwork, in order to try to survive, since their livelihoods had been taken away. So the plundering of the Jews was an integral part of the Holocaust and kind of a first step. So people know Auschwitz, people know the gas chambers, but they don't know how massive and how orchestrated and organized this plundering of the Jews in particular happened to be. So just to give an example, the greatest dealer of modern art in the world at that time was Alfred Fleckheim, who was a German Jewish art dealer who also happened to be homosexual. And he lost his gallery with masterpieces by the greatest modern artists to Aryanization in 1933. That's 1933. What is Aryanization? Aryanization is a Nazi term for moving property from Jewish owners to Aryan, that is non-Jewish owners. And there's all kinds of ways that that is done, but in the early phases of Nazi Germany, that was done with a legal veneer. That is, they didn't just march in with boots normally and grab stuff. They orchestrated all kinds of legal constraints, a web of legal constraints, until the artworks or whatever it was had to be transferred. In Fleckheim's case, they actually did have Nazis who showed up at an auction and said it and shut it down. But in 1933, and it was one of his own employees, Alex Wammel, who happened to be a Nazi stormtrooper, who became the owner of the gallery and continued to trade. And this is typical. This is how it happened, but people don't know that. So what happens? You have, at the end of the war and immediately after the war, the tremendous effort, like in the films by Monuments Men, Allied art historians and curators who come in, and their mission is to protect the great cultural heritage of Europe, to save it from the salt mines and the other places. That's number one. And two, to repatriate it to the countries from which it had been stolen, but not to the Jewish owners to which it had been stolen. So, for example, art that had been stolen from France went back to France. Art that had been stolen from Italy back to Italy, from the Netherlands back to the Netherlands, but it didn't go to the original owners if the owner was a Jewish owner, unless it was a very powerful person. It was the mission of the countries which received the art to give the art back to the original owners, which of course we now know they didn't do for the most part. They did a little, but that's why there's also so much art that's left. That's one of the reasons. So you had this massive effort. It was a huge effort to document the Nazi looting and to restitute artworks, at least as far as the countries, up until the early 1950s. What happens in the early 1950s? Well, Germany had been occupied by the Allied forces. They pull out. Germany regains its sovereignty. The Soviet Union becomes a massive threat, so all eyes turn to the Soviet Union. The Korean War starts. So the geopolitical situation makes it so that we forget about Nazi Germany. We forget about basically all of that, except for the Nuremberg trials and all of that. But basically, geopolitically, that's no longer the concern. And so information that was available up until then disappears. Archives are closed. Documents are classified, top secret. There's little or no research. And for a long period after that, there's nothing but silence. There's kind of like a dark curtain comes down over all of the looting. I mean, part of that has to do also that people were finding out about the enormity of the Holocaust, and it seemed somehow wrong to think about property when you were realizing how many people had been massacred. So, so you go from the early 1950s to basically the late 1990s. That is the end of the 20th century with nothing being done. There's no information, there's nothing. Then, for reasons which here I can't explain, in the late 1990s, having to do with various kinds of revelations and archives beginning to creak open. By the way, in Germany, they kept closing the archives and then adding on 30 years and adding on 30 years to keep them sealed, constantly keeping the archives sealed. So, but in 1998, there's a huge change. And this is the Washington, it's called the Washington Conference. And something like 44 countries gathered. And they signed an agreement. They signed a commitment to shed light on this period and to look into Nazi looted objects of all kinds. It was the same time as you had the Swiss bank settlements, at the same time as they're talking about Nazi gold. It was a time when they were reopening archives and rediscovering information which had been forgotten or buried. And so as a result of this conference, museums promised to publish provenance information on websites and to be transparent about ownership history How many here, when I say the word provenance, how many people here are familiar with the word?
Except that I think of it as provenance.
Provenance.
In English, I'm not sure what
it sounds better. Okay, so provenance, when we're talking about art and looted art, provenance is the history of ownership of an artwork. That's one thing that it is. The other thing, and when I talk about it, it's more this other thing, is the story that someone told at a specific date and time for a specific reason about the history of the ownership of the artwork. They're not the same. Okay? So anyhow, they promised to start publishing this, and this was made possible by the new technology of the internet. Because all of this, I mean, Google still didn't exist as a company at that point, right?
No, right.
So all of this is new. All of this at that time is brand new, and you're starting to get a technology you didn't have before,
I mean,
where you could share this information.
CompuServe. It was CompuServe and email.
CompuServe and email, and everyone thought,
Right.
wow, this is amazing. So, so 98, that's a watershed year. Then I'm going to jump forward to 2016, an act of Congress called the HERE Act, which was probably the last perfectly, what do you call it when both parties agree on something? Bipartisan initiative where it was passed overwhelmingly by both parties, Democrat and Republican. And what the HERE Act did is it said museums can no longer, or in general, you can no longer use a time limit defense against an art restitution case. Because what had happened is, as people started to realize, thanks to new transparency about provenance, where their artworks were, and started to make claims, the museums in particular would use a defense called laches, which said, you waited too long. You should have told us earlier. You know, well, okay.
Statute of limitations.
Kind of, yeah, basically. Right. And they said, you've got to stop doing that. So they were throwing case after case out of court before you even got to discovery or testimony or anything under oath on technicalities, saying, well, you waited. You should have said this in 1938 or something. So those are that's a very, very small bit of history, but I think some of those are the important dates.
Was there a particular person that spearheaded the 1998 Washington?
Yeah,
Was there someone who brought that forward?
There were a couple of people who were incredibly important, and one was Stuart Eisenstadt. And Stuart Eisenstadt, President Bill Clinton named Stuart Eisenstadt, I forget the exact title, but he made him like the special envoy for these kind of affairs. It was Stuart Eisenstadt who piloted through the whole negotiation with the Swiss banks. The Swiss banks behaved very badly, and there was a $1 billion settlement with the Swiss banks, and Stuart Eisenstadt is absolutely instrumental in all of this. And he wrote a fabulous book, a really, really good book, which by the end of the talk, hopefully I'll remember the name of his book, but it's very, very good describing all of this. His role is primordial, I would say. So what I'm going to try to do is talk about, in the case Zuckerman v. Metropolitan Museum of Art, I am Zuckerman, some of the things that shocked me in this case that I think people aren't necessarily aware of, that claimants experience. I'm not alone in this. So what are we talking about in my particular case? So we're talking about a couple named Paul and Alice Lefman. They're German Jews who live in Cologne. They have no children, but Paul Lefman of Cologne has a nephew who lives in Chicago, who is also named, confusingly, Paul Lefman, and that's my grandfather. And actually, my father's real name is also Paul, and my sister's name is Paula. So it's so my grandfather, Paul Lefman, when he was already a very tiny child, his father, Richard, took him.
His father's name wasn't Paul either?
No, his father's it's Richard and Paul are brothers.
Okay.
Richard and Paul are brothers in Cologne, and Richard comes to America. And so Paul Lefman, as a small child, went to visit his uncle in Cologne, and when he was a young man, He even lived with his uncle in Cologne and worked in his factory. Paul Leffman of Cologne had a factory with like 1,000 people, and they made some kind of rubberized clothing. So this Paul Leffman, he owned a Picasso, and Paul Leffman and his wife Alice had to flee the Nazis to survive because they were Jewish, and he died in Switzerland. And that's basically what I knew in 2004. And so what you see here, this is the house. That's Paul Leffman's house in Lindenthal, Cologne. As you can see, it's quite a big house. And this is the dining room of the house. And behind the table, you see a Picasso. And that is the actor. It's a very, very large Picasso. This is a publication from 1921. It was an architectural publication, and it had a huge spread on the Haus Leffmann, the Leffman house. It had like, I forget, 14 pages or something. And these photographs are from that publication, along with other photographs that show the rooms of the house, the chairs, all of that. And this is really important because that's the only document that I had ever seen, even just briefly, that showed a Picasso in the Leffman house in 1921.
So the Leffmans were they were prominent.
They
were prominent, wealthy.
They were wealthy German Jews, and they lived in a neighborhood, Lindenthal, which had a lot of wealthy German Jews that lived there. So, but that is all I knew. Like, I didn't even know the name of Paul Leffman's wife. I didn't know anything. That's all I knew. So, on October 4th, 2004, I find the family Picasso. Because I didn't even know if it had survived the war, because the house was entirely destroyed during the war. I didn't know if it had survived, where it was, anything. And I found it on the internet thanks to the site of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which, because of the Washington Conference, was publishing provenances. And this was, back in the old days, in 2004, I don't think Google was yet incorporated, so it was the dial-up modem with the it was like that. And this is what it said about the ownership history of the Picasso. P. Leffman, Cologne, in 1912, private collection, Germany, until 1938, Hugo Pearls, New York, in 1938, Paul Rosenberg and Company, New York, 1938 to 1941, Knoedler and Co., New York, in 1941, then Thelma Chrysler Foy, New York. And she's the one who gave the painting to the Met. So that's what it looked like. Of course, I was extremely excited. I go running up the stairs. I tell my family, they're like, no, so that can't be the Metropolitan. Are you kidding me? So that was, once I got over my shock, I started paying attention to what was written in the provenance. And this private collection, I was like, well, who's that? What are they talking about? What private collection? And this would be the question that I would be trying to answer for years. Just one question: what private collection? So
Paul Leffman's.
No, he's the first name.
I know.
There's a name. Someone's between Hugo Pearls, Paul Rosenberg, and Paul Leffman. Who is it? So.
Yeah.
And does that really matter to them? Like that proof that it went from the owner to.
It's going to be the key question. It's the absolute key question, and in lots of these cases, that kind of question is absolutely crucial. You have to pay attention to it. So it would take 7 years, thousands of hours of research, and the intervention of lawyers before the Metropolitan Museum would discover that Paul Leffman owned the actor continuously to 1938, and that there had never been a private collection.
So who wrote that in?
This is great because it's like having somebody ask the question that I am then going to answer. So this is, we didn't even practice this. We didn't practice this. So, so how did private collection get there? So what eventually happened is we're trying to answer this question, and as I'm digging into the research, and I can't even begin to describe how much research was involved and how much I didn't know that had to be found out. Eventually there was a court case, Zuckerman v. Metropolitan, which went from 2016 to 2020, through three courts, including we did a petition for CERT with the Supreme Court of the United States with a number of incredible amicus briefs. Anyhow, I'm not going to talk about the case today. So if you're interested in the case, you can go to a site, Zuckerman Case Files, which has all the legal filings and not all of the newspaper articles, but a good number of the newspaper articles about it.
Did you spearhead? You spearheaded this.
I'm Zuckerman.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just making sure.
Yeah, I'm Zuckerman. I'm Zuckerman. Actually, no. Actually, what I should say is I'm Lefman, because my original name is Laurel Lefman.
Oh, okay. Zuckerman's your married name.
It's my married name. My real name is Laurel Lefman. Yeah, so people think, oh, who's Zuckerman? She has nothing to do with the Lefmans. Well, you know, until I got married, I was Lefman. So anyhow, if you're interested, all of that information is online on Zuckerman Case Files. So I realized as I was preparing this talk that people might look at the case and think, oh, 2016, 2020, that's 4 years. It's not 4 years, it's 20 years. It's 20 years. And so I tried to do like a little timeline with some of the key dates in the story that I'm going to tell you. Because the court case it's important, but it's a small part of the story, I would say. So I've told you how I found the Picasso in 2004. I forgot to tell you, I immediately asked for advice from people, and they say, well, you know, ask the museum about the private collector thing. So I talked to the museum people. And so the Metropolitan knew that I was asking questions because we talked on the phone. And then in 2005, that's going to be the next slide, I go to archives to find out what happened to the Lefmans. Because one of the things that people told me is, find out what happened to Paul and Alice Lefman. Find out, because there's this big gap in the provenance, if, you know, how long they owned the painting for, because at this point I didn't know, and whether they sold under duress or whether it was seized or, you know, what happened to it, because we didn't know. So in 2005, I finally got access to the archives in Düsseldorf. There are archives, they're called Wiedergutmachungsarchives, the restitution archives, and they're not for art, they're for property. They're for the shops and factories and houses and, you know, all of those things that were stolen from the German Jews by the Nazis. But to get access, you have to be, if you're not a professional researcher, which I was not, you have to be a blood relative, and you have to prove that you are a blood relative. How do I do that? I had to get all the birth certificates and find out where my great-grandparents lived and where my grandparents died, and get the original documents and find out their address and find out where the factory was and all these things. And so I'm writing like hundreds of emails to people to ask for archival information, you know, just all over, because I don't know any of this stuff. And I'm begging my family to go, I'm begging my family to go into their attics and their basements and dig out documents and like, where is stuff? And so, I mean, many of you have probably done genealogical research. It's not so simple. So it took me several months to gather the documents that I needed to prove to the Germans that I had a right to look at these files. And at the time, since I didn't even know the name of Paul of Cologne's wife, I couldn't look into her files. So I have never seen her files. So what you're seeing here, this is a stamp. So I go in, you have to imagine this place. I stayed for like 3 days in some small town near Düsseldorf. And you like walk through this big silent forest. It's all very kind of lonely, into some big, gigantic old building. And you walk up the stairs and you kind of knock. And there's like some old man who, I don't know, the image of Bartleby the Scrivener comes to mind. And the whole place smells of dust. I'm not allergic, but I practically had an allergic reaction because it's like dust everywhere. And I had planned the visit, so he had my files ready, and the files were stacked like this big. And everything's paper. None of this is digital. And at the time, we didn't have the cameras or anything like that. And so you take the file, you go sit down in the dusty reading room, and you open it up, and you start going, it's all in German, and you start going through it, and then when you want to photocopy it, you have this like little piece of paper that has, what's it called when you like write on it and it makes a little copy behind it? Yeah, carbon, right, a carbon. And you fill each page you want, you fill out by hand, and you give it to the old man who couldn't care less. And then there's a limit. It's like, no, you made too many requests today. You have to come back tomorrow. It's literally like that. So, but what I was looking for was what happened to the Lefmans in Cologne and whether they had made claims for things, maybe they sold stuff under duress. So, and of course I was hoping for a trace of the painting. And how it works is the Jews after the war, when Germany was still under Allied occupation, they would go to and fill out all of these forms. And so Paul Lefman and Alice, after they survived the war and came back, they didn't come back to Germany, they came to live in Switzerland. Paul Lefman made a trip to Cologne, I think he must have been in his 80s at the time, to make these claims. And so it's form after form, and the form will say, what's the property that you're making a claim for? They'd fill it out, the factory at such and such an address, and then there would be this question, sold under duress? And the answer, yeah. And so they made claims for the house, that big house you saw, and the factory, which were both Aryanized in 1935 and 1936. So in your mental map, you're thinking 38. This is 35 and 36. And this is common.
Did you say what year this was that your great-uncle filled these forms out or went to fill the forms out? What year?
It was sometime after the war. I don't know exactly what. Yeah, I have it in the form, but I don't know. I don't remember it. But it was sometime after the war when they came back from Brazil, where they had taken refuge. And so you have form after form. So for the house, for the factory, and for the flight tax. And the flight tax was this tax that they imposed. It's not really a tax. It was just a way of grabbing money from the Jews. And so that when the Jews did manage to flee, they didn't have any assets. That was the idea, that they were impoverished. But it was proof of duress. Like they were in a bad situation. And immediately when I got home, I told the Met that this is what I found. So I think one of the things that really shocked me in this whole experience as a claimant was that I personally had to prove the Holocaust. I personally had to prove every step of the goddamn Holocaust instead of just like there's history and here you are. I personally had to prove it. And if you look at our amicus briefs, we have the best experts in the world describing these things. But why should they have to? You know? So anyhow, the thing is that Paul and Alice Lefman's flight wasn't just Paul and Alice Lefman. Everybody's fleeing from Germany at the time, or from Austria. And so what you see in these arrows is the rest of my grandfather's family. So Paul and Alice, they go to Brazil. They go through Italy, Switzerland, no, they go Italy, Switzerland, Portugal, and then Brazil. But other members of the family went to South Africa. Other members of the family went to Israel. Others went to France, to the UK. And then there were some who got out through Shanghai. There's a lot of people who came out through Shanghai to get to the United States, or stayed in Shanghai or get to the United States. I didn't know anything about any of these people, but I was finding out about them as I was going through the archives. But the thing that I think really deeply shocked me was that when trying to explain the transaction, what happened to the actor and why they sold it, I was told, well, it's a normal commercial transaction. Normal commercial law applies. It's a normal commercial transaction. And you know, everyone is fleeing, the whole family is fleeing, and not everybody made it. You know, there were a lot of family members who were killed in the Holocaust. So I thought that really misrepresented history, that museums would make you try to argue that. I thought that was not good. And they do that to all the claimants. So this is just a little timeline of events of Paul and Alice Lefman. I don't know if you can see it. So you have 35, the Aryanization of the factory and home. In 36, Lefman, who's still in Germany, refuses an offer for the painting. Someone contacts him and says, I want to buy it. And he says, no. In 37, the Lefmans flee to Italy because Italy is still considered more of a safe haven for Jews at the time. But Italy, Mussolini has an alliance with Hitler. And that's going to be a real problem. So in April, there's a decree for the reporting of Jewish-owned property. And you see, that's really crucial because it meant that every Jew, no matter where they were in Europe, if it had anything at all to do with Germany, or in this case, Italy, they had to report all their assets. And the reason was because the Germans were going to take them. So the photo you see here, that is Florence. That is Hitler coming to Florence to massive crowd acclaim with Nazi flags because Hitler and Mussolini had an alliance. And Mussolini invited Hitler to come and tour Italy in 1938, in May of 1938. And Paul and Alice Lefman had taken refuge in Florence, where Hitler comes in May of 1938. In June, the next month, he sells the actor, and to finance his escape through Switzerland to Brazil. So I really, so I'm pretty shocked by the attempt to isolate what they call translocations of artworks from the context in which they occurred. So there's a period now. So in 2005, I find the evidence. I find out more about what happened to Paul and Alice Lefman. I found out that they were very much persecuted as Jews and that they had fled. But there's a long period where there's no, I mean, we're searching every archive. We're searching archives in Germany and in France and in Austria and in Israel, just like everywhere. But we're not advancing in the provenance research. And the Met, who knows that I'm asking questions, they're telling me, oh, we have no idea why private, we don't know. We don't know. But then this amazing thing happens. In 2010, I don't know if you remember it, some lady apparently tripped and fell into the actor at the Metropolitan, and she tore a big, like 7 inches. She tore like a 7-inch tear in the canvas of the actor. And it was like headlines. My mother in Arizona saw it on the Arizona news, It was a very big thing. And you had these fabulous headlines like $40 million wiped off the value of the actor and all that kind of thing. Art student who trips. So that was pretty amazing. But to make it even better, this happened just a couple months before a gigantic exhibition. One of those blockbuster exhibitions is supposed to open in New York that's called Picasso in the Metropolitan Museum of New York, and the actor is one of the stars of that exhibition. And so you have all these like breathless headlines. Will they be able to repair it in time? Will it appear in the, so it was a fairly amazing time. And at the time, I couldn't say anything about what was going on, that I was asking questions that belonged to Lefmans and all of that. I was still being quiet about that. But they printed a new catalog. This is the catalog from 2010 that was printed for that exhibition. And I was hoping that with all the attention of the world focused on the painting and all of my questions, that the Metropolitan would find the true story of the actor and put it in the catalog. So I flew to New York. I went to the expo. There was even a special room where they showed in a loop, like a 3-minute video of how they had repaired the actor and all of it. It was like a really big deal. And you'd walk in And it was archway after archway after archway, and at the end of the archway was the actor in the center of it. You know, it was like it was a big deal. And so would they fix the provenance? Unfortunately, no. What they did is they created a new, much longer provenance, but they said Paul Leffman, 1912 to 1913, then private collection Germany, 1913 to 1938. So they have him selling it in 1913. And not only did they say that Paul Leffman sold it in 1913, but they added a new owner, this Haviland, who had never in 100 years been associated with this painting, and for which actually no sources exist that name him together with the painting. And they put it on a plaque next to the painting. So when you went in, there was something like 300,000 visitors. And when they went in, they saw a plaque next to the painting that talked about the first owner, Frank Bertie Haviland. So this was all very surprising and a big shock. And I wrote to the Met afterwards to say, oh, I visited the exhibition. It was very interesting. I was kind of curious about any progress on the research, blah, blah, blah. And they sent me back this big packet, which was so fabulously, what's the word that I want to say on camera?
Dissimulation?
All of you can propose words, and I won't say them. That after that, I took a decision. I was no longer going to speak directly to the Met. After that, it was lawyers who spoke to the Met for me. So this is a watershed for me. 2010 was watershed. After that, I turned over all communication to lawyers.
So the museum is just lying?
Yes. So I turned over all communication to the lawyers, and my lawyers were Herrick Feinstein. Larry Kay was the lead lawyer on that. And so then it starts getting very interesting, because the Met until then, they were just dealing with me, little nobody. Now they're dealing with Herrick Feinstein. So this is something that I don't think people really realize, because of all the stories you read in the press. Oh, museum found it, proactively researched it. No. So that's not my experience. Maybe it's someone's experience. So from 2004 to 2010, that's 6 years, I'm communicating with the museum and asking questions. There is basically no progress by the museum on provenance research. 2010, the law firm is communicating with the museum, and suddenly the museum finds proof that, in fact, Leffman sold in 1938, not in 1913. And why is this date so important? Because 1913 is before the Nazis come to power. 1938, that's Kristallnacht, you know? So that's fairly amazing. And then in 2012, the Metropolitan finds the reason, the explanation, they say, why the private collector? Where does private collector come from? So I had asked the question first in 2004, and in 2012, here's the explanation they give me. So what this is here is a catalog, French paintings, and French paintings, a catalog in the collection of Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a catalog, like a catalog raisonné of paintings with provenances that was published by the Metropolitan in 1967. And it's the first catalog that is published with the Picasso in it for the Metropolitan. By the time this catalog is published, both Paul and Alice Leffman are dead. So they never saw this catalog. But what the Met found inside its own offices was a unique copy of this catalog that was a pre-publication draft catalog that was used to prepare publication. And this catalog had on one page a photo of the painting being described, and on the other page a place for handwritten annotations by the curator. In this case, the curator is Margareta Solinger. And so this catalog had next to the actor this annotation, and that's the accession number of the actor. It says, Pearls bought it in 1938 from a German professor in Solothurn, Switzerland, who had been thrown out by Nazis, Herr Josef Müller from Sollenthurn, lent it to the Zurich exhibition in 1932, but Pearl says, no, he cannot remember the name of the German da-da-da. So that's what the curator wrote in this single copy found in the Metropolitan's office, written by its own curator for its own publication in 2012. And this is what the provenance in the catalog as published looks like. It says, Paul Lefman, a German private collection. So why didn't the curator put all of this in the catalog? Because it was all false. Not one word of this is true. There was no German professor in Sollenthurn. There was no host of, there's lots of Joseph Müllers in Switzerland, but none of them have anything to do with the actor. It wasn't even lent to the Zurich exhibition in 1932. That was made up. So the curator on the phone gets information from the art dealer who lies, makes up a story. She writes it down and then uses that to put in German private collection. So that's the origin of German private collection. According to the Metropolitan, it was their general counsel who sent me that. Oh, yeah, sure. OK. So here's the problem. The problem. Here's the problem. The problem is a museum is considered a reliable source. Once the museum says German private collection, that's it. You're good. You're good to go. That's what everybody else cites and nobody checks. And that enters the historical record and is cited by everyone. So as we advanced, as I and the team, we had a team of researchers combing archives. As we advanced in the research, we found layer after layer after layer of false provenance for this one painting. And so from 1938 on, every provenance written about the actor was false. And this, as you see, I'm saying this on camera because it's simply true. And so what do you see in this graphic? The top line, those are the false stories that were told. So Italian collector is selling the actor. No, it was Paul Lefman, a German Jewish refugee who happened to be in Italy, who's selling the actor. Actor lent by Tannhauser. No, Tannhauser never owned the actor. He did not lend it. Paul Rosenberg bought the actor from Vollard, an outright lie. Paul Rosenberg bought the actor from Paul Lefman. The actor is in the collection of Vollard, no. He sold it in 1913 to a private collector. That's false. And then John Richardson, if you're an art lover, you might know the fabulous biography, 4-part biography by John Richardson. The one time he mentions a provenance for the actor, he says Pierre Lefman sold it in 1913. And then in 2010, of course, you have the sold in 1913 to a private collector. So what the middle is the year in which that false story was told. So Italian collector was told in 38, lent by Tannhauser was told in 39, Paul Rosenberg bought the actor from Vollard was told in 1941. So you have these layers upon layers of false stories being told over time. Then in bottom, in yellow or orange, whatever, that's the name of the person telling the false story. Frank Pearls, James Sobby Thrall, who's a trustee of the MoMA, Paul Rosenberg, very famous art dealer, Chrysler Foy, that's Vogue magazine, it's a beautiful spread. Pierre Dex, I actually wrote to Pierre Dex to ask him about it, and he was very nice. He said, I just sent the museum a questionnaire, they sent me back the thing, and that's what I wrote. Hugo Pearls, of course, Solinger, John Richardson, the Metropolitan website, Gary Tintereau, who was then curator of European paintings at the Met, who's now the director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and Crystal Force, who was their researcher. So they're the ones who told all these false stories. These are the dates at which they told them. But if you know art history, you will recognize these names because they are cited as reliable sources in many, many other provenances.
So do you know who bought it and
No one acquired it in 1913. Paul Leffman didn't sell it in 1913. He owned it from at least 1912. There's no record of anyone else owning it before Paul Leffman.
So
We
when
don't.
he sold it under duress.
He sold it in 1938,
38, okay.
and he sold it to, together, Hugo Pearls and Paul Rosenberg. They bought it together as a joint ownership, not as it was written, first one then the other. They bought it together from him in 1938. So they both knew who they bought it from.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Is there any documentation of who the Met acquired it from?
Oh yeah, yeah. Thelma Chrysler Thoy gave it to the Metropolitan.
So that was documented.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely documented. Yeah.
And was there any documentation of who Chrysler Floyd acquired it from?
Yes, she bought it from Knudler. Knudler, as you may or may not know, was, at the time I started the research, Knudler was the most prestigious, most ancient art dealership in the world. And by now, Knudler is out of business because they sold a bunch of fakes, and there were so many, and they sold the fakes to the wrong people. They sold the fakes to Wall Street billionaires, and the Wall Street billionaires came after them and put them out of business, and they had to shutter their doors. But actually, Knudler sold a lot of Nazi looted art. It's just that they had such an aura of prestige, no one bothered them about it. So one of the things about this kind of research is that it's incredibly fact intensive. It is so hard to find this information. You have to, and it requires a whole bunch of different expertise. You need genealogists, and you need art historians, and you need lawyers, and you need Holocaust historians, and because of all the countries involved, you need experts, for example, in Italy. And there's been so many attempts to whitewash history. Like people have an idea of what happened in Italy in the Second World War. Well, that idea is not very accurate. And so there's new research coming out. And so you have to deal with the very best scholars who are doing the top research. And so all of this requires an unbelievable amount of effort and specialists, and it's in all the different languages. And there's a problem of access and time and cost, and very, very few people can do this. Very few.
Very expensive.
It's very expensive. Very few people can do it. And yet you're up against closed archives and a ticking clock. Because one of the things that I didn't mention is, why was there such a long period between when I first found the painting and when we actually filed the lawsuit in 2016? It's because there's a rule in New York called demand and refusal, which meant that once you made the demand, you had 3 years to complete the thing, to do the case, but you didn't have the information. So if you make the demand too early, before you have the evidence, what can you do? So you're caught against a ticking clock and closed archives. So when I started research, the Pearls archives, the Rosenberg archives, and the Knudler archives were all inaccessible, all closed. And the Pearls archives even closed for an additional 3 years after we started the research. The Picasso Museum here in Paris required 3 levels of authorization to read a handful of letters. It took months and all this back and forth. It was incredible. And then once I was there with my researcher, we said, oh, well, could we also look at this other letter? He said, no, that's not on the list. And she had come from Germany for the research. The Metropolitan documents, like this catalog, are only known to the Metropolitan. Nobody knows about them. There isn't even a catalog with an index that says that they have this document. People don't know about it. And I asked them a couple months ago, I said, can I photocopy the rest? Because I'm curious, since that provenance was false, I was wondering about the other. So I made a request. I said, I would like to photocopy this entire thing to do research on it. And they said, this is only accessible to metropolitan people. So people out in the world don't even know this exists. And the false provenances, they waste your time. They create confusion. They're exhausting to debunk. It's just like a cloud of false information that you have to cut through. Think fake news.
Yeah.
Think fake news. It's like that. And so you're cutting through this swath and following down trails that lead nowhere because the information was false to begin with.
So what does it do for a museum to keep all of this under their hat?
That is a question for museums.
Money, just money.
Yeah, I mean, I think journalists, if there are any journalists in the room, when you're interviewing a museum, ask them. I can't even begin to imagine, you know, what story they tell themselves. So,
the most important false provenance starts with Pearls and Rosenberg, right?
yeah,
The other ones you bought, okay.
yeah.
What was their motivation for creating a false provenance?
One would have to ask them.
What
But
do you think?
my personal opinion, that something about the true provenance bothered them if it was public. That there was something in the true provenance that they didn't want to share.
But the idea that they could be accused of having bought something under that somebody had to send under duress, and so
Well, think of that mental map again. 1933 to 1940, the German Jews are under unbelievable pressure, and from 1938, the Austrian Jews as well. But in France, business is normal. But you know, people do things and maybe they're not proud of it afterwards. I don't know. I mean, but those are questions for them. I often get asked questions about, you know, what other people are thinking, and I really think that it's important to ask museums why they're doing this, or to ask, you know, ask the authors of false provenances why they wrote a false provenance.
And Paul Rosenberg was based in Paris, right? Paris
Yeah.
and New York.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Can I ask a question about the concept of under duress?
yeah.
Because, I mean, I've heard that term before. I don't know, is it a legal term, meaning there is an actual legal application that someone can say, I sold this under duress. It was during wartime, I needed the money, I needed to get my family out, so I sold it cheaply. So to me, I'm thinking this, maybe being the devil's advocate here, I'm thinking he was under duress, yes. It was a horrible, frightening time. He needed to get a huge family out of Cologne, and he sold it for way less than it was worth, right? But he still made that decision to sell that, right? So this idea of under duress, clarify that a little bit more?
I can't really because I'm not a lawyer, but what I can tell you is that this has been a very important topic for a very long time. And so, and this is where the problem of, is it normal commercial law or are we talking about the Holocaust, is incredibly important. And so when the specialists gathered in 1998, they made it very clear that it was because of the entire mechanism of the Holocaust, which included taking away any way that a Jewish person could live and making them undertake extreme measures in order to survive, that made a question of duress under the Holocaust something special. So that the normal commercial laws of duress, oh, I sold because, you know, I gambled everything away and I needed more money or something like that. It's not that. It's a very particular historical circumstance. And when they did the agreement in 1998, they left it a tiny bit loose, according to the language, with the Nazi looted art. But about 4 months ago, there was another conference, very important conference, where they closed that loophole. And they said, and I should have put it on the slide, they said very specifically that we are including duress sales in the definition of Nazi looted art. And so it wasn't a Nazi who took the painting.
Right.
But I do have to say, all the tactics I'm talking about, they're used in cases even where Nazis took the paintings. Yeah, so, I mean, there's always something.
Yeah.
But it's a very good question, and duress is a very important word, and one has to, that's why this divide between what is happening in Germany in those years and a normal commercial transaction is so incredibly important. So thank you for that question.
But maybe at the time that the museum was donated and given that concept of what you're saying has now changed didn't really exist then, right? So they were thinking that that was a bad thing, that it was sold under duress. They got access to this painting that had.
Really?
I would think.
No.
You don't think so?
No.
Why?
No. Because people knew the history of the Holocaust.
Of course,
They
right?
knew there were forced sales.
Right.
They knew this was a stolen, rapacious thing.
Right.
They knew this.
Right.
They just didn't want to admit it.
And I'm not disagreeing with that.
One of the amusing things about the Metropolitan Museum is that its curator of European paintings was a monuments man. Theodore Rousseau.
Sorry.
One of the curator of European paintings at the Metropolitan Museum was a monuments man.
Wow.
He is one of the people who wrote some of the most important reports. There's a series of reports called the Art Looting Investigation Unit reports. And it's this massive undertaking where they had the foresight to try to document the Nazi art looting networks. And they had, you have the big monuments men, but then you also have like a small investigative team, which is very, very small. It's Theodore Rousseau and, oh gosh, I can't remember. It doesn't matter the other names, but there's really like 4 key people. And Rousseau is one of the absolutely key people who knows everything about Nazi looting. And he is the curator at the Metropolitan Museum. So ignorance is going to be that's going to be a hard argument to make.
I don't know if I was saying ignorance. I was more thinking about just how we've evolved as humans in thinking that things that we used to think that were okay, systemic racism, for example, we've now come to the idea that that's not okay, right? So in the past, I think it could be said that maybe people just didn't think the same way that we think now. And I'm glad that we think the way we think now, but I'm just wondering that as an idea.
There's a wonderful book by Jonathan Petropoulos about Nazi art looting networks. And I said there's a wonderful book about Jonathan Petropoulos. And he did a wonderful book about Nazi art looting networks. And then recently he did a book about, I think it's Bruno Loos, who's a very key Nazi art looter. And in his book, he talks about how this guy would come to New York and meet up with Rousseau and some kind of nonsense about adulterous relationships in big cars and roaming around New York. You'd have to read it to get the exact details. But anyhow, I highly encourage everyone to read Jonathan Petropoulos' book about this. But what you had, when you had this geopolitical shift in the 50s, like I said, it was like anything goes after that. There was silence. I can't speak to what's going on in their minds. But if you have a monuments man, normally there's things he knows. He interviewed these people. You know, he spent 2 years of his life writing these reports. So what happens is claimants, and this, I'm broadening it now to other claimants, they want the truth. That's what we want. We want the truth. And we're faced with a pattern of delaying tactics, and we're faced with a pattern of provenance errors. And this, whether it's duress, whether it's the Nazis marching in with their boots, shooting someone in the head and taking the painting, no matter what the situation, the tactics are the same. So inspired by the COVID, multiple layers of protection to avoid COVID, I took their nice little cheese design and applied it to delaying tactics in restitution cases. Now, not all of these apply to my case. Some of these, like deny it's the same artwork, that applies to the very famous case Simon v. G.D. Searle. Goodman v. G.D. Searle in Chicago in 1996, where the first line of defense is, it's not the same artwork. The one you're looking for, this is not the droid you are looking for. Basically, very common argument. Then deny the claimant's family ever owned the artwork. Make up something saying, well, okay, but prove that you owned it. Then deny that the claimant's family owned the artwork after 1933. So that's our case, for example, where you place it in 1913. Deny that the transfer was linked to the Holocaust. It's a normal art transaction. Deny that documents exist, even if they do exist. Fail to find documents. Put obstacles to accessing archives. Layers of errors that confuse and mislead. Challenge every fact. Force the claimant to prove history. Accept nothing as true. This kind of fight, one might recognize these tactics. Do incompetent research. Overlook labels, names, and sources. Oops. Oh, I didn't see that. I didn't know. Need for more research. speculations, theories. There's a whole language art in provenance text. It probably could have maybe been such and such. And then you, the claimant, you're running after all of this stuff. There's no proof. It's pure speculation. But they'll enter that into the historical record. So there's a pattern of these kind of delays. Oh, wait, there was another, here. There's also a pattern of provenance errors. Like, all of these errors are just from my case, just from the actor. That's a lot of errors. Omit the Jewish owner, insert false owners, wrong sales dates, add private collector, misspell the name, ignore the sources. That's just one case. That many errors by the premier institution in the world. And these errors, you find them in lots of cases. I mean, one of the things that's really, I think, interesting about my case is that it's a kind of Rosetta Stone. That is that you have that many provenance errors. You have provenance errors all the time in Holocaust-linked art. It's a feature, not a bug. It's a feature, not a bug. But to have that many errors, that's exceptional. And so it gives you kind of a touchstone for a database of errors that then you can go and look for in other cases. And so that's what I'm doing now. The case is over, and I've gone from being a claimant to being a researcher because my first profession, before being an author, was computers. So all that stuff that Adrian said, I don't understand this, explain it, that's what I'm doing now. So I'm very interested in the patterns that appear when you take a lot of these cases, put them together, and analyze it in a big data fashion.
So are you helping find other owners?
I don't specifically like act to find other paintings. What I do is I publish data sets and I publish tools. And when people contact me to ask for help, I just give them help. So, I mean, I'm pushing for, I just want to help everybody now. I think we're all in the same boat. I kind of wish there was a class action lawsuit, because one of the things that we haven't had is hauling people into court and getting them to testify under oath. They keep getting the cases dismissed on technicalities. So you don't have discovery. Like, discovery would be very interesting. You know, like, people will ask me the question, oh, did your grandfather know where the painting was? Well, I don't know. He never told me. I have no idea, but who would know would be the museum if he wrote to them and contacted them, and that would be in their archives. So the person to ask is not me. And I think that but museums tend to close those archives. So
the case is over?
The case is over.
Did you win?
No, it was dismissed on the technicality that we took too long to file it. So, and as you see, it's not like we had good information. So there's a tremendous double standard, which is amazing to me. The museums can make any error imaginable, and that's okay. But the claimant is assumed to have perfect knowledge of everything in the world.
Yeah. Not only that, but the fact that they take just in the normal provenance, they just take the word of someone basically as truth.
Yeah.
And then you can show all the proof that you show there, and it's like, well, you didn't file that in time. That's not.
Yeah.
They just dismiss that.
Yeah.
Did you also say in there that most of the cases are dismissed?
Yeah.
Like a large percentage? You mean?
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, there aren't that many cases because, as you can see, it's very hard to bring a case. But secondly, the museums have a track record of not only getting cases dismissed on technicalities, not always, but very often getting them dismissed on technicalities. But in several cases, they've sued the claimants.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so I don't want to get it wrong. No, I'm not going to mention the museums who did it. There's like 5 museums that have done that. They sue for, they ask the judge to recognize that they are the owners. And so they turn around and do a lawsuit against the claimants, which you can imagine is terrifying for a claimant. So, but right now there's something super interesting going on. And that is, because all of these have been civil lawsuits, right? And so what happened very recently, I don't know if you've been following the case of the Sheila paintings. I don't know if you followed the case of the Sheila paintings that were owned by Fritz Grunbaum. Fritz Grunbaum, you've seen the like Cabaret?
Yeah.
So the inspiration for the Joel Grey character in Cabaret is Fritz Grunbaum, who was a Jewish entertainer and art collector, and he had a massive collection of paintings by Egon Schiele. And he was murdered in the Holocaust, and his paintings were stolen by Nazis and then reappeared in the Western market, and they're in museums all over the world. And there have been quite a few lawsuits claiming these things, and the lawsuits have sometimes gone one way, sometimes gone another. And a fabulous story was invented to make it seem like there was a legal transfer. So anyhow, a very nice provenance was invented for that. And but a few years ago, there was a lawsuit where the judge, the case was called, I think it was Grunbaum v. Nagy. It was against an art dealer named Nagy. And the judge in his ruling said that experts don't get to make up the proof that they cite. And he basically, he just like,
That's exactly what they've been doing.
yeah, he said like, stop that. He said like, stop that. And when the dealer appealed, the judge really came down hard on them. And so, you know, it was like the first official recognition that, you know, stop making crap up, basically. And so now what's happened is the Manhattan DA, who's someone who's very against looted art. He does a lot of stuff with looted antiquities. You might have seen these headlines where the Manhattan DA has seized looted antiquities from a lot of places. Well, he also seized looted Schiele paintings from, I think, 8 different museums in America. And he said, this is looted art. We do not want New York to be a hub for art trafficking. And he seized them in place, but he seized them. And like 7 of those museums said, okay, we'll give it back. One museum said, not over my dead body, and that was the Art Institute of Chicago. And the Art Institute of Chicago made huge court filings against the Manhattan DA. The Manhattan DA filed, I'm not a lawyer, so I get the names wrong, so please forgive me for that. It's basically an application for seizure, for forfeiture, something like that. It's 160 pages. It's the most fabulous document. And it literally says, international conspiracy, international criminal conspiracy. And the reason it says the conspiracy is ongoing because for a painting to keep its value, it has to have this provenance. And so they continue to make up a false provenance in order to keep this looted piece of artwork. Now, this is the case that's in the courts right now, but that's Manhattan DA in a criminal case against the Art Institute of Chicago, which, we come full circle, was the first really big art restitution case in America, which was Goodman v. J.D. Searle, who was a trustee at the Art Institute of Chicago.
Do they ever use the argument of possession of the law?
I haven't seen that argument. I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that.
And did you have a chance to review the archives of Paul Rosenberg? Because you know the fact that the Metropolitan, through the donation acquired from Paul Rosenberg, he was the prime dealer for Picasso, so he was very credible, right, in terms of. But why, you know? So there must be archives of his provenance, and the possibility to show that his provenance was made up. You know.
This is a very interesting and very touchy question. Paul Rosenberg wasn't the dealer for Picasso right at the start. Flechtime was a much bigger dealer for Picasso, so was Kahnweiler. Kahnweiler was a much bigger dealer. But various things happened. In particular, World War I, Kahnweiler was a German citizen, and all of his artworks were impounded. So all of the Cubist artwork that Kahnweiler had was impounded and then sold off. The auctions to sell off the artwork that was impounded were officially run by Paul Rosenberg's brother, Léonce. And it's after that that Paul Rosenberg becomes later Picasso's dealer. So he wasn't always Picasso's dealer. So like in 1912, he wasn't Picasso's dealer. That happened later.
But in 1938?
In 1938 he was. In 1938 he was, and in fact, one of the letters that we did get to see when we went to the Picasso Museum, I was sitting in the Picasso Museum reading the letters that Paul Rosenberg was writing to Picasso, the original letters that Paul Rosenberg was writing to Picasso as he was fleeing the Nazi invasion. And they had, if memory serves, they had like 2 cars, and like one of them breaks down. And he's writing to Picasso. It's amazing to read these old letters because he must have been terrified, right? He must have been terrified, but he's writing these letters, you know, oh, dear Pablo, you know, a funny thing happened on the way to the, you know, that kind of tone. That's not what he said, but it's that kind of tone. And one of the things that made me realize, I'm not answering your question directly here, it's just kind of a funny story. One of the things that made me realize is that people under extreme duress, the last thing they write is, I'm under extreme duress. Yeah. Because those letters actually those letters are really funny because they basically start with, why don't you write me? So a lot of letters like, why don't you write me? You know, I write you, you don't write me. But that's one of the things. As far as the archives, our researchers, the archives were controlled by Elaine Rosenberg, who is, I forget the exact relation. Is it the granddaughter, or I forget the exact, I don't want to say something that's wrong, okay? But the Rosenberg archives were controlled by Elaine Rosenberg, and you have to get access. Like if they don't like you, they don't give you access. And so our researcher had several very interesting conversations trying to get access, in particular on the phone with Elaine Rosenberg. It's not so easy. You know, it's friendly people who get access, not people who are not necessarily friendly. Yeah. And the other thing about this is that the villains here are the Nazis. They're the ones who created these situations that put people in these impossible situations. And
yeah, but the museums contributed to that.
They
took advantage of it.
There are a lot of people who take advantage. The problem is you have this situation which is completely impossible for a lot of people. Not everyone behaves in the way that they're most proud. Time passes. When the information starts to come out, what do people do? And so that's what we're seeing now is what do people do when the real information starts to come out? Because I don't want to cast stones at anybody for the stuff that they did. I just want people to tell the truth. That's all. So I'm sure there's a lot of information there, but it's friendly researchers who are allowed in. It's not everybody.
Laurel, what's the estimate of works of art, number of works of art involved in this situation?
It's hundreds of thousands, really. But the problem is to find the looted artworks, looted or forced sales or whatever. And of course, they're not all masterpieces. I mean, like this one is easy to identify, but sometimes you'll have a Van Gogh and there's a bunch of copies of the Van Gogh. Well, I mean, Van Gogh is already a very big name, but you'll have like a smaller name and a bunch of copies. And it's hard to say it was this particular painting and not another painting because they look so similar. It's very difficult. And you don't have enough value to interest the kind of researchers who can do this kind of work. So you have a vast hinterland of stuff that was looted, but nobody has the wherewithal really to look for it. But the thing is, to find the stuff that's looted or it's sold under duress, you have to go through millions of paintings. So it's not like they're all sitting there with a tag that says, look here. It's you have to go through all this stuff. And because the provenances are false, you can't just read the provenance and say, oh, it's this one.
Wow. And there must be there are other people like you out there researching this? And
there are a lot of researchers. It's an area where you have a lot of really good people and you have a lot of people who are not so good. And they all wear the same title. But the people get to know who's who and who's doing what. And there's some very, very good people out there. So I just try to focus on the very, very good people.
So where's the painting now?
It's at the Metropolitan. But that's actually a funny question because I was in New York recently, and normally it would hit, like when I saw it before, there was the Picasso, there was some beautiful blue period picture because the actor is right on the cusp between the blue and rose period. It's a transitional painting between the blue and rose period. It's a very, very important painting. And so it was between one of the very famous, sad blue period paintings and the fabulous cubist, what's her name? Gertrude Stein portrait. So it was like on that wall. But now, I had to look like crazy for it in the museum. They've moved it to like the 18th century or something. It's now it's now between two Goyas. And so they've moved it. So they're
trying to disguise it?
I don't know what they're doing. Theoretically, what the idea is to have pictures talking to each other. That's what they, c'est un dialogue avec, So you have like, and so in that area you have a few paintings en dialogue with other paintings, and so it's dialoguing with Goya.
Do you have a good photo of it?
Of the
Nothing's up at the moment.
Now the problem with Picasso, and it's actually another interesting question, but I'm probably going to go way over time. They extended all the copyright because, like, the actor was painted in 1904, 1905, which is 100 years ago, right?
Yeah.
But they extended the copyright to I forget how long, like 70 years after the artist's death, and so. So you have copyright issues. So one of the issues that you face if you're dealing with modern art and you're looking for it is they've made the copyright make it impossible for you to show the images. Say, I'm looking for this, But I have the picture in the dining room I have because that's not under copyright. That was published in 1921 and the 1921 copyright has expired.
The picture that you
in the
have
dining
in
room.
the dining room.
Yeah, and also I think there's some rule like if it's not the main focus of anyhow, they're very complicated copyright rules. Yeah.
You mentioned at one point, not today, that maybe with Manhattan DA that New York now has to identify art in its public museums that have been looted or are in question.
That was a law. Yeah, it was a law passed I think by the governor. I think pushed that. They're supposed to.
Yeah,
I mean, well, you see how well things are,
No, but I mean, you said you saw there was a plaque there.
Yeah, but the plaque that they put next to the painting didn't mention Lefman. It mentioned someone who was not actually connected with the painting. So, which
this just leads me to believe that you can't believe anything you read or see in any museum of any exhibition, almost.
It's one of the things that really interests me is, and I guess I'll conclude on this. I have these questions which came up in this research, and this is what's guiding my research now, is just to answer these questions like why so many false provenances for a single painting. And what do false provenances tell us? And I think of it kind of like a murder scene, like in a Columbo, where the guy committed the murder. Columbo knows who did it, but the problem is to prove it, and what he uses is the cover-up to prove it. It's like he's not proving the murder, he's looking at the signs of the cover-up. And so for me, false provenances are a kind of clue that's very like a cover-up. And you can follow false provenances to the source. And so one of the things that interests me is to inventory all the people who created false provenances and see what else they were writing and how those hold up if you actually go down to source documents. But the only way to know what's true, and you can know what's true, it's possible to know what's true, I do want to state that, is to go down to contemporaneous source documents. Not stuff like when you read a provenance and it says, according to a letter from so-and-so, or worse, according to an email from so-and-so. No, that's not a source. You have to trace it back to the original source documents. Yeah?
Hi, how did you manage to fund all of this work? And was it like a money pit?
The way that these really big restitution cases work is you have two choices. One is you're paying out of pocket, or there's some kind of financial setup with some kind of agreement with the lawyers where they take a certain percentage afterwards, and maybe there's some kind of financiers in the background as a kind of venture capital thing. So there's a whole ecosystem around this, and it's all very unfortunate that this is how it works. But very few people have access to any of this, you know. And I was in a very special position, having lost my job, so I had a little bit of time, and and just by chance speaking some of the languages that were needed, because what would somebody who spoke no German at all do in a German archive? You know.
Yeah, it would be tough.
Yeah, this is before Deep L. There was no Deep L.
What would we do without it?
Yeah. So there's a lot of barriers, and then there's an ecosystem that's grown up around it, which is not unlike. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, so you can't take anything that I say about the law seriously. But in all of these cases where you have a bunch of little people and they're going up against a giant industry, there are mechanisms that have been invented to try to make that possible.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Do you give yourself credit for being one of those mechanisms that help that?
I haven't thought of myself that way. Am I a mechanism? I mean, I do try to publish tools, and right now I'm working on some super interesting tools that I think will be really, really useful. I do try to publish tools and make them available to people so that they can take it further. But these cases, the other thing that's interesting about patterns is each individual case is so complicated, it's almost impossible. So each individual case is already very complicated. And then when you have layers and layers of disinformation, someone from the outside cannot make heads or tails of it. Right. When they're given all the false stories and thrown into the mix, maybe the true story, they have no way of knowing which is true. And so I think the only way you can actually see the patterns is to step back and look at a bunch of these stories. And when you know that a story has been proven false, that tells you a lot about what to think of the people telling that story in the future. So if, for example, you have a name that's been inserted into one provenance that's false, that actually never was involved in the history of the painting, and you see that same name in another painting, you know, check this very carefully. And if you see an author who wrote an entirely fake story about one painting, and you see that author appearing in another case, you know, check that very carefully. And so you have to step back and look at the patterns, and AI is coming in at exactly the right time for that. AI is very good at that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It calls into question all their collections, anything that they've ever deaccessioned, anything they've, right? It's not just one.
It's not just one. And deaccessions, you mentioned what a deaccession is when a museum sells a painting. And deaccessions are used very often, they say, to improve the quality of the collection, but you deaccession forgeries and you deaccession loot. And like you want to slip it out the door without any trouble. And so one thing that you really look at when you're looking at this stuff is deaccessions. Absolutely.
I think that people hold art on such a pedestal, and therefore museums on a pedestal, and maybe art dealers as well. And people are forgetting that this is a business. It's a business.
It's a $1 trillion business.
It's not a church. It's a business. People are making billions and billions. People invest money in paintings and put them in freehold and never even have them, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a way of laundering money. It's a business, right? And business is never honest.
It's true, and it has this veneer. It has this veneer of prestige and culture and all of that. And so I find psychologically that even people who know that maybe an institution has made a false provenance, they'll still cite the institution and another provenance without checking. It's so strong, this desire to believe authorities. It's like embedded in us. Yeah.
Sure, it's like we believe the New York Times, ha ha. Right?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, are there any more questions?
There's one question. Remember you said when you went to Germany and you found the documents that your great-great-grandfather?
My great-granduncle.
Okay. That he had actually, after surviving, went and filed trying to get that painting.
No, it wasn't for the painting.
Oh, it wasn't for
It was the painting. I did not find a
oh,
mention
okay,
of the
I'm
painting
sorry.
there.
I misunderstood that.
No,
Okay.
no, it was for the house and the factory because the people weren't able to make claims for paintings like that back then. because he, you know, it was, the painting wasn't seized by Nazis.
But do we know that?
Oh yeah,
We
yeah,
know
we
that
know
now.
it wasn't seized. Yeah, he sold it to Paul Rosenberg and Hugo Pearls in 1938.
But then isn't creating a false provenance, like in the case of Rosenberg, where you found that he bought the painting and then, you know, provenance coming from his office is false. Isn't that a crime in itself? You have created a false
I wish it
provenance?
were. In antiquities trafficking, you often see, like if you look at newspaper articles about antiquities trafficking, they'll mention the creation of false papers, and that will be part of it. But that's for the crime of, you know, the current crime of antiquities trafficking. I would love it if creating a false provenance were a crime, but I've asked lots of people, and they always tell me, no, it's not a crime.
it's
So I mean, that's if I made the laws,
Actually not a crime.
apparently not.
I guess the idea is that the buyer, it's his responsibility to check and to make sure that the provenance is accurate.
Well, one of the
No notaire checking for a title.
well, one of the areas
I mean,
that
that's what has to happen here.
well, the problem is who's your notaire. But one of the things that really interests me is this question of good faith, because what they always do, this is so common, it's unbelievable. Like Google good faith and Nazi, put Google good faith and Nazi together and see what comes up. And one of the things that really interests me is this argument of good faith. So what happens is they'll say, when it's found out that something was, and now I'm not even going to talk about duress sales, literally looted by Nazis and someone was killed, okay? They'll say, oh, well, I didn't know that. I bought it in good faith. And so I'm working right now on a project to test that. So good faith in one transaction would be hard to see, right? How do you know? How do you know intention? But if you step back and look at a pattern, like say you have the same art dealer who happened in good faith to buy, you know, 4 artworks that were looted, how do you calculate that? Can you put a score? Can you, with the help of, say, advanced digital techniques and calculations, when you have a lot of these cases, put a score on the likelihood that it is good faith or bad faith? How do you, like if you're a criminal investigator, how do you define intent? At what point does a pattern show some kind of intent? And so I'm very interested in that, because right now all they have to do is say, oh, I bought it in good faith. And you know, it's like this wonderful, you all know the musical Chicago, the cell block tango, where the woman says, he ran into my knife 10 times. So I think there might be a way to get beyond just the, oh, I bought it in good faith thing, because I'm suspecting that they weren't all bought in good faith.
But there's a difference between buying in good faith, okay, whether you believe it or not, and buying from a person that is known, that you know, that the dealer knew, and then the dealer, when he's on the selling side, creating a story.
Yeah.
That's clearly criminal.
It's clearly something,
Yeah.
but but this is a really serious question, because this is a question that I have been asking lawyers again and again. How is this not criminal? And they tell me there isn't a law. There's not a law. So it's frustrating, and especially when you see something like that.
That's U.S. side. That's U.S. law, not necessarily French law, right?
Yeah, I don't know the details of that in France, but this is so common in Holocaust linked. The creating a false provenance is so common that I use that as a clue to find looted art.
So for property, you have to have the title searched, and there's absolutely no question. You could get to the point where when art gets to a certain value, it would have to have title like real estate property. Of course.
If you look at the provenances that are being published right this very minute by Christie's and Sotheby's, which have provenance research departments, just look at them, and just look at them and see how complete those provenances are.
Probably can't trust
Spoiler.
them. Yeah, probably can't trust them.
Even at auction houses, it's buyer beware.
Yeah, and they have these conditions. But so, I mean, I don't know what to say. These are questions that I've been asking myself. And when I ask lawyers, they tell me, you know, sorry, there's no law against doing certain things. So what the Manhattan DA is doing in this incredible fight with the Art Institute of Chicago is something incredibly interesting. So that's something to follow very closely. And the Art Institute of Chicago is going all in on a story which I personally think was a story that was entirely made up. And I'll say that on camera. And
You already have.
And the art dealer who is the originator of the story was also Gurlitt's art dealer. You might have heard of Hildebrand Gurlitt and his son. Hildebrand Gurlitt was Hitler's, you know, art dealer for modern art to raise cash for the Nazi regime, and his son, what's his son's name? I've forgotten his son. Cornelius Gurlitt was the recluse who near Munich, where they found, you know, all of these artworks in some stash. His dealer, he would travel to Switzerland to sell, was the same guy who gave the story that the Art Institute of Chicago is citing for the history of this Sheila that it has. So, you know, that's not great.
Wow.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm afraid these people will be watching this video, so, yeah. Well,
Any other
there we are.
questions?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting, right? I mean, the fact that we have this kind of an expert here in our midst, I think, is amazing that you've been through this. So I want to thank you for doing this. Yeah.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I am, and thank you for asking that, because I'm trying to find the courage to send it to an agent. I've written the book, and I just lack the courage. That's all. Yeah.
Well, that ought to be easy. We'll support you with that.
Yeah. I need to be braver.
Okay, thank you, Laurel. Thank you, everyone, for coming.